Hi guys, hope you guys are well and taking good care of yourselves. I thank you for joining me on another video. This video was taking some time due to the evidence that I've had to gather for you guys. Even though in my last video I've said many times this is not an attack on Muslims. I agree that you should pray regularly every day. I don't even disagree with cleaning yourself before you speak to God. I also mentioned that dressing in a sense to let everybody know that you follow the God of Moses, I have no disagreement with. There were a few comments. One was as if why didn't I study Arabic? And my response was, well, if your Allah is all knowing, me learning Arabic is irrelevant. Like I mentioned, I was raised by Yahweh and Yeshua. They have been there for me since my youth, and I've never once had to speak Arabic. If Allah is the God of all and He's the all-knowing, learning and speaking Arabic should be irrelevant. Now, there was another comment, one who has actually now deleted her comment, but unfortunately for her, she didn't know that I kept those comments. So I will be exposing the lies written by this user, and I will put it on a mantle for all of you to see. And then I would use the Quran itself to expose the lies in the Quran. So moving forward, my aim is not to attack. My aim is to expose the Jews of this world, because it has been written that Israel will come back and unite. Israel will come back to Yahweh. And if you don't know, Israel is not a place. Israel is a people, the descendants of Jacob. There are 12 tribes of Israel in West Africa, but along the way to the journey to West Africa, some of us did stop along the way. Every black person, every Negro descends from Noah. We all descend from Noah. So we are all Jews. Even our brothers in Sudan who became pharaohs and idol worshippers, these people are Jews. The 12 tribes of Israel is concentrated in West Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. So unbeknownst to people in the Middle East or Northeast Africa, the 12 tribes of Judah has been taken not only into the Americas, the African Americans, the Haitians, the Caribbeans, the South Americans. Not only do the descendants reside in these countries, the descendants also reside in Arabia, all the way to India. 17 million Jews were taken into Arabia. 17 million Jews have descendants in Arabia that don't even look Negro. They look like Latinos and Latinas. If your hair gets wet and it curls naturally, if your areola is dark brown, meaning if your chest is melanated, you need to do your DNA test, because you and African Americans have something in common. Judah, the blood that runs through your veins may be sub-Saharan African. If you have more than 2% sub-Saharan African in your system, this will tell you that you also have a Judean blood in your system, and it is up to you to call unto the God of Moses, to call unto Yahweh, to call unto Yeshua. This is our Creator. I am trying to unite everyone as it has been written, because understand this, If you don't do it, your children or children's children will. It is time for you guys all to know who you are. That is the main aim of my channel, is to let Israel know we still exist in many nations. We exist not only as Negroes, but we exist as Latin Americans. We also exist in the Middle East. This video that I'm going to show you is very long. Please be patient. I am not only showing you that Islam is not a peaceful religion. The vast majorities of countries in Africa and the Middle East are prisoners of war. Your ancestors were taken from sub-Saharan Africa and they were made Islam or faced death. Every African nation that is Islamic, you are prisoners of war. Islam is not your true religion. Islam is a religion that was imposed onto you. Look at what is happening in Iran. These people are starting to wake up and realize that everything that they have been living under has been forced upon them. These things are part of the prophecy in the Bible. If I wrote a book today contradicting everything in this book and told you that my book is the real book, is the truth, would you follow it? The answer is no. If I held a gun to your head for the fear of death, you will follow it. And after generations, after generations, after generations, you will be indoctrinated into the book that I've written. That's what this is. This is not a correction. It's a contradiction of the God of Moses. If this was to claim not to be from the God of Moses, we wouldn't be having this discussion. But the claims in this book that it is factual, when actually it is a contradiction, a book written by warlords, and their actions were implemented in this book and justified by the God in this book to give themselves more credibility. This is what we're facing today. I am here to tell you that you are a prisoner of war, and I have plenty of evidence to show for it. Today we have descendants of Jews who are prisoners of war, and their descendants are indoctrinated in this book, killing other descendants of Jews for this book. There is a big issue going on. We have people who are unaliving their own children for this book. There is an issue. Nothing I am saying is to divide us. Everything I am saying is to open the eyes of those of you who are descendants of prisoners of war to understand who you are. And if you believe that you want to worship the God of Moses, you need to go back, as it says in this book, to the Injil. The Injil is a Greek word for the Bible. You need to go back to the Injil. You can still be a Muslim and call yourself a Muslim because, as I understand it, you are submitting to one God. But the God that you must be submitting to, your creator, is a triune God. If you haven't already, like, subscribe. You don't have to share. I do not wish to be famous. My aim is to open your eyes to who you are, so this prophecy can be fulfilled with you rather than without you. I'll see you in the next video.
First of all, I've chosen to call this trade the Arab slave trade because Arabs were a key part of this network. Arabs weren't the only people involved in this trade, but still, most of the rulers and raiders involved in the process were Arabs. Most of the important markets were in Arab cities as well. I didn't call it the East African slave trade because it wasn't just done through East Africa. Other trade routes were involved as well. Slavery was already practiced in Arabia and most of the areas that the Muslims conquered in the 7th and 8th centuries.
Did you hear that?
Islam did not abolish slavery, but some regulations were set which were increased upon by the caliphs. There were 4 ways someone could end up a slave. First, a child born to slave parents was a slave. Secondly, someone captured in a jihad against non-Muslims could be made a slave. Third, a slave could be purchased. Or finally, a slave could be given as a tribute. The people living under Islamic rule, Muslim or non-Muslim, could not be enslaved unless they rebelled or they helped an enemy of the state. Bernard Lewis writes, "Slaves were excluded from religious functions or from any office involving jurisdiction over others. Their testimony was not admitted at judicial proceedings. In penal law, the penalty for an offense against a person, a fine or bloodwit, was for a slave half of that for a free man. While maltreatment was deplored, there was no fixed penalty. In what might be called civil matters, the slave was a chattel with no legal powers or rights whatsoever. He could not enter into a contract, hold property, or inherit. If he incurred a fine, his owner was responsible. He was, however, distinctly better off in the matter of rights compared to a Greek or a Roman slave, since Islamic jurists, and not only philosophers and moralists, took down accounts of humanitarian considerations. They laid down, for example, that a master must give his slave medical attention when required, must give him adequate upkeep, and must support him in his old age. If a master defaulted on these and other obligations to his slave, the Qadi could compel him to fulfill them, or else either to sell or emancipate the slave. The master was forbidden to overwork his slave, and if he did so to the point of cruelty, he was liable to a penalty which was, however, discretionary and not prescribed by law. A slave could enter into a contract to earn his freedom, in which case his master had no obligation to pay for his upkeep. While in theory the slave could not own property, he could be granted certain rights of ownership, for example, for which he paid a fixed sum to his master. In the Islamic world, various ethnicities were enslaved.
This is a peaceful religion, remember? Remember, this is a peaceful religion.
Not just people of African descent. In fact, they were all considered to have their own advantages. Ibn Batlan in his handbook tries to characterize them. He recommends Indians and Nubians as guards of persons or property, as laborers, servants, and eunuchs he recommends Zanj, and as slaves, Turks and Slavs. Yes, even white people could be enslaved. However, there was a distinction between them. The white slaves were called mamluk, or owned, and the black slaves were called abd, which means slave. Where white slaves could rise up to respectable positions, the black slaves could not. The Mamluks had their own dynasties in Egypt and India, but the abd slaves never did. In fact, even in literature or poetry, we hardly find an example of a black man, slave or otherwise, after the Umayyads. Even free Muslim people weren't all treated fairly across the Muslim world, but as always, there were exceptions. An early chronicler, Jashiyari, writes an anecdote about a man called Abdul Hamid, who was apparently the secretary of the last Umayyad caliph. The story goes that the caliph had received a gift of a black slave from a provincial governor.
Pay attention. Pay attention.
The caliph was unhappy with him and told his secretary to write a letter of gratitude and disparagement. Abdul Hamid wrote, "Had you been able to find a smaller number than 1 and a worse color than black, you would have sent that as a gift." This story, along with many others, show that Arabs didn't view African slaves particularly nicely and preferred other ethnicities if they could get them.
Pay attention.
Even in the times of Prophet Muhammad, Byzantine and Persian slaves were found in Arabia. Africans were just one of various slaves available. However, over time the number of black slaves grew disproportionately. Main reason for that was the stabilization of the frontiers. Turks and Indians started to embrace Islam, and so not many of them could be enslaved. And as jihad slowed down after the 8th century, so did the number of non-white slaves. Mostly against Byzantine and other European states, captured prisoners were ransomed or exchanged. While it's easy to say that the distinguishing factor between slaves and non-slaves was religion and not race, that's not all that true. The ruler of Bornu, for example, complained in a letter to the Sultan in Egypt about how the slave trades were ravaging Bornu and enslaving free men, even members of the ruler's family and Muslims. While it was forbidden to enslave Muslims, in practice, if you were a black Muslim, you could be enslaved. Very early on, the Muslims signed a treaty with Nubia, where Nubia would provide slaves in exchange for peace. This was probably the reason that Nubia was not taken over by the Muslims for quite a while. However, conquests across the Sahara opened trade routes across the African continent. And among the things transported across the routes were religion, ideas, and unfortunately, slaves. Muslim Arabs bought slaves from these routes all across northern Africa and brought them back into the Islamic heartland.
Message.
This started almost right after the conquests and the subsequent stabilization of the frontiers. The coast of the Zanj, modern Kenya and Tanzania, was used by the Arabs to bring slaves to Yemen, and from there Oman and the Persian Gulf, and cities like Basra and Baghdad is where they were sold to the Muslims. Somalis, before they were Islamized, were a large number of slaves imported, and later interior peoples were exported as slaves from the Somali coast to cross into Yemen, and from there via Mecca, Damascus, and Baghdad. In Mesopotamia, a large number of Zanj slaves were used in thousands of plantations and saltpeter mines. Apparently, the working conditions were so terrible that they revolted numerous times between 868 CE and 883 CE and became a serious threat to the Caliphate. This went on for centuries and became a system, but it wasn't as severe as it later grew into. At the time, various African tribes raided each other and enslaved the prisoners, selling them on the frontiers of the Islamic Empire. From here, Arabs took over and took these slaves inland to be sold on the borders, but also in India and across the Mediterranean. Unfortunately, the holiest site in the Islamic world, Mecca, became a bustling market for slave trading. People bought slaves in this market when they visited for Hajj, the Islamic pilgrimage. Slaves were brought there as a commodity which could be sold to get some cash. They were easier to protect than other precious commodity in a huge caravan, so people brought them along. People also brought them in Mecca since people from all over the world would gather there. All the way up to 1962 CE, slaves were being sold in Mecca. In The Legacy of Arab Islam in Africa, John Elambilla Azuma writes the following. The main area from which slaves were drawn and exported to Egypt and other North African Muslim locations and then to the Islamic wider world were the central and western Sudan. The traffic started mainly from Nubia, from which the people living to the south and east of Dongola were taken to Egypt. Slaves were exported also from Kanem Borno via Fezzan to Cairo, Tripoli and Kairouan. People groups living around the Lake Chad area were later exported along this route. While in the 18th and 19th centuries, Bagirmi slaves, especially eunuchs, formed an important part of the slave traffic along this route. Some were later sent from Tripoli to ports in modern Turkey, Greece, Albania, and southern Yugoslavia, which were all at the time under the Ottoman Empire. Slaves from the Middle Niger and the Atlantic coast were also drawn from Gao, Yavargla to Tahret in modern Algeria, and Kairouan, and later from Timbuktu through Tuwat to Tlemcen, Sijilmasa, Fez, and other centers of the Muslim Maghreb, from where some passed into Muslim Spain and Sicily when it was under Muslim domination between the 9th and 11th centuries. Ibn Khaldun testifies to the presence of large slave populations in the 14th century North Africa, when he wrote that the blacks constituted the ordinary mass of slaves. Muslim Berber groups of North Africa, like the Tuareg and the Moors, became the chief agents in the raiding and in the traffic of black slaves to North Africa, Spain, Turkey, and the Mediterranean world, some of whom were taken as far as India. As early as the 8th century, the Berber Ibadi community of North Africa virtually controlled the trade routes and thus the traffic in black slaves. The terrible conditions on these routes and the increasingly predatory nature of the slave raids, one historian estimates that for every slave that was sold in the market, 10 had died on the way there. These raids were also labeled jihad by raiders to legitimize them. Neither the Muslim raiders nor the buyers of the slaves really cared about who the slaves were and where they came from. The Swahili coast became a bustling hub of slave trading. A network was established across the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf. In the 18th and 19th century, when ivory trade was on the rise, these slaves were also forced to carry ivory and other precious commodities on their ways to the markets by the raiders. It was during those centuries that the slave trade reached its peak. From around 1800 CE to 1850 CE, most European countries abolished slavery, and the slave trade started to die on the western side. However, on the east, it was picking up further. The British did try to have countries abolish it, but it didn't work. Not only did it not work, but it probably had the opposite effect. The colonization was taking place, and a lot of these countries exported slaves. Muslim Borno, for example, entered into a trade deal with the Ottoman Empire to provide them slaves. Muslim Africa ravaged the continent and raided deep into it. The stories of these raids are disturbing, to say the least. Most Muslim rulers of the region were interested in slavery because it was profitable. There weren't many advocating for abolition, even though in Europe slavery had mostly died out. The British could not force the rulers to do away with slavery. However, by the end of the 19th century, Africa was almost entirely colonized and the slave trade was put to an end. Muslim states of Middle East were breaking into chaos. The Ottoman Empire was the sick man of Europe. The Europeans were isolating countries that still practiced slavery. All these factors combined put a slow end to the slave trade by 1950 CE. It was outlawed in Saudi Arabia in 1962. However, slavery in some form is still practiced in various Muslim and African countries. From 1450 to 1850 CE, an estimated 12 million slaves were traded from Africa to the Americas. In around the same period, 5 million African slaves were traded by the Muslims. However, the Islamic trade existed for a much longer period than the European one, and the total number of slaves traded from 600 CE to 1900 is around 17 million.
Slavery in Arabia goes back to the pre-Islamic Jahiliyyah, ignorance period. Arabia had several sources of slave supply, and the largest among them were conflicts. Arabs would raid bordering Byzantine and Persian provinces for the purposes of getting war booty and slaves.
That's very peaceful, isn't it?
And the Ajami, Iraqi slaves, were prominent among them. Intertribal conflict within Arabia would result in the victorious side taking the surviving members of the losing tribe as prisoners, but most of them were ransomed before they could be turned into slaves. But the majority of slaves were imported from Africa. Mecca was a major trading center of the region at the time, and trade caravans, including those which transported African slaves, were going through Mecca. Arab slave owners would purchase them in Mecca. Also, raiding parties would attack caravans and capture slaves for themselves or sell them later. There were two types of slaves, purchased ones and slaves born in the house of their master. Arabia's climate and terrain limited the scope of work in which slaves could be used, but they would work as servants of rich Arabs, as shepherds, and as caravan guides. Female slaves would also be used for sexual purposes. In theory, Islam saw a natural state of a human being as being free, stated as al-asa huwa il-hurriya. Islam brought some limitations and regulations to slavery in Arabia, but slavery was such an ordinary phenomenon for that age, along with being a fundamental element of Arab society, that it was not possible to outright prohibit slavery. All of the Arab elite, including the Prophet, owned slaves. But at the same time, there are numerous Quranic verses and hadiths describing the emancipation of slaves by the Prophet Muhammad, such as Bilal, who became the first muezzin, caller for prayer in the history of Islam, and Zayd, Muhammad's stepson. During his farewell sermon, Muhammad said, "An Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab has any superiority over an Arab. Also, a white has no superiority over black, nor a black has any superiority over white, except by piety and good action." Historians Neusner and Son argue that prohibiting slavery in the context of 7th century Arabia apparently would have been as useful as prohibiting poverty. It would have reflected a noble ideal, but would have been unworkable on an immediate basis without establishing an entirely new socio-economic system. And its recommendation that slaves be freed is on the same plane as its recommendation that the poor be clothed and the hungry be fed. Thus, slavery was not prohibited in Islam. But the ascension of the Islamic Caliphate led to some reforms in terms of treatment of slaves, their release, and amended procedures related to enslavement. The Quran stated that a slave Muslim is better than a free pagan, that it was better to marry a slave Muslim female than a free pagan. Islam barred Muslims from enslaving other Muslims, called for humane and kind treatment of slaves, and prohibited killing them. The Abbasid Caliph al-Mutasim freed 8,000 of his slaves on his deathbed as manumission was encouraged by Islam. A child born to a freeman father and a slave mother was considered free. This slave woman could not be sold off anymore and would be set free upon the death of the master. The state prohibited freemen from selling their children into slavery as a punishment for debt or a crime. Despite this, the slave population increased due to purchase through military campaigns, commercial purchase, procreation of slaves, and interstate agreements, where the Caliphate insisted on payment of tribute through the import of slaves. People of the book, Jews and Christians, were safe from being enslaved, but Muslims could purchase Jewish and Christian slaves, in case they had become slaves before their purchase, but it was allowed to turn pagans into slaves, even if they would decide to convert to Islam. Moreover, there was a distinction in terms of enslavement between Dar al-Islam, the realm of Islam, and Dar al-Harb, the realm of war. Dar al-Islam was the territory where Islam was prevalent, and therefore the laws of peacetime applied. while Dar al-Harb was the territory dominated by non-believers who did not recognize Allah and Muhammad as his prophet, therefore a peacetime law did not apply there. This loophole was used to import slaves who were already Muslims, or for the castration of slaves, a practice which was prohibited by Islam. Although good treatment of slaves was encouraged by Islam, slaves were essentially rightless. Their testimonies were not admitted at judicial proceedings. Offense against slaves required half of the punishment envisaged for the same offense against freemen. Slaves were not allowed to enter into a contract, and so on. The death rate of slaves was quite high, particularly among those employed for plantation and mining slavery. On the other hand, the vast majority of slaves lived under better conditions than, for instance, their counterparts in ancient Greece and Rome. Masters were obliged to provide slaves with medical attention, shelter, and support in old age, and were prohibited from overworking them. They could be forced by Islamic courts to emancipate a slave whom they had mistreated. In some cases, slaves had a contractual right to buy their freedom over time, or be emancipated upon the master's death. The expansion of the caliphate and its military successes were the primary sources of slave supply. People of different races and beliefs, such as Assyrians, Copts, Persians, Nubians, Berbers, Indians, Greeks, Turks, Slavs, etc., were enslaved by the caliphate.
Message.
Slaves were acquired from all over the Middle East, Egypt, Iran, the Caucasus, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, India, Spain, Central and Eastern Europe, even China and Southeast Asia. A significant part of the slave supply of Arabia, even before Islam, was from Africa, with countries like Ethiopia and Nubia being the most prominent in this regard. This continued after the ascension of Islam too, and historian Yosef ben Yochanan argues that jihads were brought to Africa as early as the year 640 AD. The expansion of the caliphate into Egypt and sub-Saharan Africa, into what the Arabs called Balad ul-Sudan, the land of the blacks, enabled a higher supply of African slaves into the empire. This supply was both from military conquest and booty, along with treaties signed with African states, where they agreed to supply the caliphate with slaves annually. Moreover, Arabs set up slave trading posts along the southeastern coast of the Indian Ocean, including the archipelago of Zanzibar. This paved the way for the major African slave trade to the caliphate. Black African slaves were sold in slave markets in Egypt, South Arabia, and the Maghreb. Historian Paul Lovejoy estimates that close to 10 million Africans were shipped out as slaves to Arabia and the caliphate. According to him, every year 5,000 Africans were brought to Arabia as slaves between the years 650 and 1600. Luis Felipe Jalen Castro argues that 8 million African people were sold or sent into slavery through the Oriental and Trans-Saharan slavery routes between the 8th and 19th centuries. Historians might disagree on the numbers, going as high as 30 million, but the truth is that millions of Africans were forced to live and work as slaves in the caliphate. The slave trade from Africa to Arab countries continued right until the beginning of the 20th century. For instance, slavery in Saudi Arabia was formally abolished as late as 1962, in Oman in 1970. Africa had become a pragmatic choice for slave supply of the caliphate, as towards the 8th century, most of the borders of the Arab Caliphate had already become more or less stable. There were fewer expansionist wars, which meant there were fewer slaves imported. By then, the Eastern Roman Empire and the Frankish Kingdom, bordering the Iberian possessions of the Caliphate, had become strong enough to oppose further expansion of the Caliphate. Moreover, they were people of the book, and enslavement of Christians was a legally problematic matter. For instance, in the 9th century, the Egyptian Christians rebelled against the Caliphate, and following their defeat, many of them were sold as slaves in Damascus. According to the historian Adam Metz, this was widely criticized in the Caliphate and was considered absolutely illegal. In contrast, sub-Saharan Africa did not have a political entity strong enough to oppose the Caliphate, and it had maintained and enhanced its position as one of the major sources of slave supply for the Caliphate. Unlike the slaves in the Americas, where they were mostly forced to work in manual labor jobs, such as working on plantations and mining, in the Caliphate, slaves were used in a wider scope of jobs. In the Americas, slaves were a major tool of production, while in the Caliphate they were mostly used in service jobs or for military purposes. Slaves worked as servants, nurses, concubines, entertainers, eunuchs, business assistants, craftsmen, builders, and soldiers. There were also types of slave jobs which existed in the Jahiliyyah period but were prohibited by Islam, such as masters forcing female slaves into prostitution for their personal material gain. Some of the jobs, particularly being a soldier or taking part in administration and business, allowed for upward social mobility for slaves, and Mamluk slaves are the perfect example of the former. In general, slaves working in domestic and urban settings were not subject to overworking and cruelty, and the problem with the Arab historiography of that period is that it's very much focused on urban Arabia, not only with regard to the issue of slavery, but in general. Slaves working in rural settings are largely overlooked, despite being subject to the hardest living conditions among the slaves of Arabia. They were mostly employed in agriculture, mining, and the drainage of marshes. These were mostly black slaves, who were more prone to being overworked, being subject to cruelty, and living in worse conditions, often crammed in dozens in small spaces. It is said that no slave lived for longer than 5 years in the Saharan salt mines. Extremely hard living and working conditions existed in cotton and sugar fields. The slave labor of the black slaves, Zanj as the Arabs called them, in the marshlands and salt flats of southern Iraq, are among the most vivid examples of cruelty against slaves in the Caliphate. But white slaves were brought to the Caliphate as well, and were mostly employed in the military, as business associates, and for entertainment of the Arab elite. This demonstrated the existence of racial discrimination in the Caliphate, despite the fact that Islam considered all human beings equal regardless of the color of their skin. Most of the white slaves were Slavic and Turkic. Slavs were considered more expensive than Turks, and were brought into the Caliphate through Germany to Spain. Prague was also one of the centers of the slave trade from Europe to the Caliphate. Meanwhile, Turkic slaves were mostly sold in the slave market of Samarkand. A good-looking white slave woman would cost 1,000 dinars. In some cases, this cost would go as high as 10,000 dinars. In contrast, a good-looking black slave woman would cost 150 to 300 dinars. Black male slaves would cost even less. Their purchase was around 25 to 30 dinars. A special category of slaves in the Caliphate were those specialized in arts and entertainment, who were educated by their masters and then sold to the Arab elite for massive sums. 1,000 to 2,000 dinars was the average cost of an entertainer. In 937, the de facto ruler of the Caliphate, Ibn Raik, purchased a popular female singer for 14,000 dinars. While Islam alleviated the suffering of slaves and placed certain restrictions on their abuse and encouraged good treatment of slaves, their lives were extremely hard. Slaves working in agriculture, mining, and construction had a shorter lifespan and were more susceptible to ill treatment. One of the sites of cruel and inhumane treatment of slaves was the Basra marshlands in southern Iraq, where black slaves were forced to work under horrible conditions. They rebelled against the Caliphate in 869 and would trouble the state for more than 2 decades.
In late antiquity, no one could envision that a vast civilization would emerge from the desert landscape of the Arabian Peninsula. But following far-reaching conquests, caliphs and sultans reigned over immense empires through eras of prosperity and of catastrophe. This is 1,000 years of Islamic history, focusing on its Middle Eastern heartland. In the 6th century, the Arabian Peninsula was the backyard of great empires, the Persian Sasanian Empire in the east and the Christian Byzantine Empire in the west. The Arab inhabitants of the peninsula were an ethnic and cultural group consisting mainly of nomadic tribes. Most of them were polytheists, worshipping many deities. This was all about to change. Around 570 CE, Muhammad was born in the city of Mecca. According to Muslim tradition, he was chosen by God to serve as the last prophet in a line of prophets, including Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. Muhammad was to spread monotheism in its true form among the Arabs. Tradition holds that over many years, the Quran was revealed to the Prophet in segments and was later compiled into the central book of Islam. At first, Muhammad was persecuted, but after migrating to the city of Medina, an event that marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar, he formed the new religion, consolidated the Muslim community, waged wars against idolaters, and united the Arab tribes into a Muslim nation. Muhammad died in 632. It was a time of crisis. Who would succeed the religious, social, political, and military leader? The question of rightful leadership will continue to be a central theme in the Islamic world throughout the ages. Muhammad's heirs established the title of Caliph, meaning successor. The first four caliphs, known as the Rashidun, or rightly guided caliphs, were chosen one by one based on their affiliation with the Prophet and personal qualities. They held power for 30 years. During this period, the first Muslim state emerged, with institutions, taxes, and bureaucracy. The caliphs conducted military campaigns and, in a rapid, colossal process, expanded the caliphate from Iran to North Africa. The Byzantine Empire lost many territories, and the Sasanian Empire collapsed. Muslim tradition considers the Rashidun period as the glory days of Islam. However, it was characterized by acute internal tensions, and 3 of the 4 caliphs were assassinated. In particular, tension mounted around the supporters of Ali ibn Abi Talib, Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law. This group, that came to be known as Shias, claimed that Muhammad had appointed Ali as his successor, and therefore he and his descendants were the only legitimate rulers. On the other hand, their opponents, who would later be called Sunnis, did not recognize this appointment. In time, the political divide will become the biggest religious rift in Islam. In 661, the Umayyads, an Arab family that settled in Syria, came to power and ruled for 90 years. The Islamic capital moved from the Arabian Peninsula to Damascus. The new authority brought with it a new political system, a dynasty, where the position of caliph is passed down from father to son. The Umayyad dynasty led the second wave of conquests, establishing an empire that stretched from Central Asia to the Iberian Peninsula. The Muslim defeat to Frankish forces in the Battle of Tours marked the end of Muslim expansion in the West, preventing the Islamization of Western Europe. The Caliph Abd al-Malik strove to centralize power in Damascus, strengthen the Arab identity of the empire, bolstered its administrative system, and initiated construction projects, notably the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. But social and political divisions, rebellions, and civil wars shook the Umayyad Caliphate. In the Battle of Karbala, the Umayyads murdered Ali's son, delivering a resounding and formative blow to the Shias. Finally, in the mid-8th century, the various oppositions to the ruling power organized into a military force that brutally massacred the Umayyad family. In 750, out of the chaos, the Abbasid dynasty rose to power. They were a Sunni Arab family that took pride in its lineage to Abbas, Muhammad's uncle. The period of upheaval had come to an end. The leadership of the Abbasid caliphs lasted for more than 500 years. Immediately following their accession to power, Muslim forces won the Battle of Talas against the Chinese Empire, bringing to a close the advance in the east. The Abbasids ceased the expansionist policy, turning their gaze inward to the construction of the caliphate. They moved the capital from Damascus to a new city they built, Baghdad. It soon became known as the largest and most prosperous city in the world. The Caliphate served as a fertile ground for poets, writers, physicians, philosophers, and astronomers. Scientific writings in Greek and other languages were translated into Arabic, forming the foundation of massive original scholarship. And so the Abbasid period is considered the golden age of Islamic civilization. The Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid, known from the tales of Arabian Nights, served as a patron of scholars, maintained diplomatic relations with Charlemagne, and even sent an elephant to Europe, arousing excitement in the Frankish kingdom. But alongside this flourishing, starting from the mid-9th century, the Abbasids in Baghdad lost control throughout the empire, while local Muslim dynasties gained power and encroached on wide territories. Gradually, the Caliph lost political and military power and became a mere figurehead. In addition, Arab exclusivity in the Caliphate weakened as Persian and Turkic elements gradually rose to prominence. The Islamic story ceased to be only Arab and became a multicultural one. In the West, Iberia was never ruled by the Abbasids, but by a remnant of the Umayyad dynasty. The Islamic presence in Spain lasted hundreds of years, slowly being pushed back by the Christian Reconquista. In the East, various Persian dynasties ruled at the expense of the Abbasids. Some of them were the engine behind a revival of Persian culture, which received a severe blow with the Arab conquest. The Persian language was reborn and adopted the Arabic script. In 945, the Persian Buyid family took control of Baghdad. Even though the Buyids were Shias, they chose not to oust the Sunni Abbasid Caliph, but to limit his power while controlling a confederation spanning Iraq and western Iran. Their presence lasted for more than 100 years. At the same time, the Fatimids gained power. They were an ambitious Arab Shia dynasty that traced itself back to Fatima, Muhammad's daughter and wife of Ali. The Fatimid dynasty spread through North Africa to Egypt, established Cairo as its capital, and from there ruled vast areas. It called for the overthrow of the Abbasid Caliph, managed networks of Shia missionaries, and was suspected of subversive activity, causing panic among the Sunni caliphs. The Fatimids ruled their shadow caliphate for an impressive 200 years, but failed to defeat Baghdad. In the 10th century, against the backdrop of the political success of Shia dynasties such as the Fatimids and the Buyids, Shia Islam took shape, turning from a collection of political groups into defined religious movements. In the 10th and 11th centuries, political and climatic challenges struck the steppes of Central Asia, stirring the movement of tribes of Turkic peoples. They were nomadic, economically based on horses and other livestock, and excellent mounted archers. Many came into the Middle East. The process was threefold: conversion to Sunni Islam, migration, and political takeover. In 1055, the Seljuks, a Sunni Turkic family, took control of Baghdad and removed the Shia Buyids. They assumed the title of Sultan, which will remain central in the Middle East for centuries to come. The great Seljuks ruled over a wide empire, but similar to the Buyids, they did not depose the Abbasid Caliph, but controlled him. In fact, the Seljuks defended the Abbasids against the Shia Fatimid threat and became the agents of a Sunni flowering. This indicates the symbolic centrality of the Abbasid Caliph and his role as an exclusive source of legitimacy in the Sunni Muslim world. In 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert, the Seljuk Sultan defeated the Byzantine Emperor. Anatolia was opened to the Turkic tribes. In the following centuries, Greek Christian Anatolia was transformed into a Turkic Muslim land. The most prominent political power of the region was the Sultanate of Rum, a Seljuk branch. The bedrock of modern Turkey was formed. In 1095, while the Islamic Middle East was politically divided, the Crusades were launched under the direction of the Catholic Church. Their declared goal? Liberating holy places from the hands of Muslim infidels. European forces occupied Jerusalem and established several states on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. Crusader presence in the Middle East lasted for 200 years. During this period, Muslims tended to see their new neighbors as representatives of an unadvanced civilization, with a culture inferior to their own. In the 12th century, Saladin, a member of a Sunni Kurdish family, rose to prominence. He was a charismatic leader who eliminated the Shia Fatimid rule and founded the Ayyubid dynasty that ruled Egypt and Syria. Saladin fought the Crusaders, defeated them in the Battle of Hattin in 1187, and freed Jerusalem from Christian hands. The blow to the Crusaders was severe, but not decisive in the long term. They would survive for another 100 years. Meanwhile, the Seljuk state collapsed, allowing the formation of a new regional power, the Turkic-Khwarezmian Empire. Formerly a vassal of the Seljuks, the Khwarezmian state controlled Iran and part of Central Asia. The 13th century marks a watershed in Islamic and world history. Far away in the steppes north of China, Chinggis Khan was proclaimed ruler of all Mongols, a group of nomadic tribes with a shamanic religion, legendary as mounted archers like the Turks to their west. Within a few decades, under Chinggis Khan and his descendants, the Mongol Empire expanded to become the largest contiguous land empire in human history. It was seen as invincible and merciless. In an ill-advised move, the Muslim rulers of the Khwarezmian Empire executed Mongol merchants. The ensuing bloodbath brought the end of the empire. By the mid-13th century, the Mongols ruled Iran, the Caucasus, and most of Anatolia. The Mongol ruler Hulagu Khan, Chinggis Khan's grandson, demanded that the Abbasid Caliph surrender. The Caliph refused to submit to the non-Muslim hordes. In 1258, Hulagu besieged Baghdad, razed it to the ground, and massacred its inhabitants. The great library of the city, known as the House of Wisdom, was no more, marking the end of the Islamic Golden Age. The Abbasid Caliph was rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses. 500 years of Abbasid leadership had come to an end. Hulagu turned to Egypt. There, the Ayyubid dynasty of Saladin was overthrown and replaced by a new power, the Mamluk Sultanate. The Mamluks were Turkic slave soldiers who were brought from the steppes, converted to Islam, and served as an important military force for Muslim rulers beginning in the 9th century. In 13th century Ayyubid Egypt, this elite warrior class gained political power, and slaves became masters. In 1260, at the Battle of Ain Jalut, the Mamluks defeated the Mongols, unprecedentedly halting their advance. The Mamluk Sultan Baybars, who played an important role in repelling the Mongols, also managed to crush the Crusaders, paving the way for their final collapse. This double victory earned the Mamluks the image of the defenders of Islam. It was further strengthened as Baybars re-established the Abbasid Caliphate in Cairo, though it played a marginal role. The Mamluks continued to rule for 250 years. By the end of the 13th century, the Mongol Empire splintered into local Mongol dynasties, led by the descendants of Chinggis Khan. Some of these dynasties, as well as many of the elites, converted to Islam and adopted Turkic dialects. This was the case with the Ilkhanid dynasty, descendants of Hulagu, who ruled from Anatolia to Iran. The Ilkhanids proved that the Mongols were not only brutal conquerors, but agents of economic, cultural, and intellectual prosperity. The Ilkhanate collapsed in the 14th century and was replaced by an empire created by the cruel Turco-Mongol conqueror Timur. The Timurids proved yet again that brutality and cultural flourishing are not mutually exclusive. The empire survived in some form until the end of the 15th century. At the same time, a new power grew in the West. Around 1300, a man named Osman emerged as the leader of a small Turkic Muslim principality in Anatolia. Osman and his descendants fought the Byzantine Empire and conquered territories in Anatolia and the Balkans, creating the Ottoman Empire. In 1453, it conquered Constantinople in a move that ended 1,000 years of Byzantine rule and is sometimes considered to mark the end of the Middle Ages. Constantinople, later Istanbul, became the new Turkish capital. The Ottoman Sultan Selim the Grim tripled the size of the empire, making use of newly invented gunpowder technologies. In 1517, he captured Cairo and executed the last Mamluk Sultan. Terminating the Abbasid Caliphate of Cairo, Selim declared himself Caliph, the new leader of Sunni Islam. The Ottoman Empire spread over vast territories in the Middle East, North Africa, and southeastern Europe. In the 16th century, two empires formed to its east: the Shia Safavid Empire, which is considered the foundation of modern Iran, and the Mughal Empire that ruled India. These three Islamic powers, known as the Gunpowder Empires, were strong and stable in the early modern period. The Ottoman Empire, the last caliphate in the history of Islam, survived for 600 years and fell only in the 20th century, following the First World War.
The trans-Saharan slave trade, or the Arab slave trade. How much do we know about that? Why do we not talk about that? Why does it seem that the people who perpetrated those atrocities on the Africans seem to get a pass? How much do we know? And again, why do we seem to not focus on the atrocities done to the Africans? And yes, we know the history of the transatlantic slave trade all too well. There has been books, movies, discussions, courses on the transatlantic slave trade. But when it comes to the trans-Sahara slave trade, there is not much. There seems to be crickets, silence. Well, today we're going to explore a bit. We're going to explore that subject a bit. We're going to look into it. Before the Europeans began exploiting Africans in the transatlantic slave trade, the roots of the slave trade began in East Africa. Arabs and others enslaved Africans and sold them across the extensive trade networks. This trade existed between the 17th century CE until the 1960s. That's right. Technically, it ended in the 1960s. However, actually, many people feel that it still goes on to this day. Human trafficking. By another name, slavery. Slavery, by another name, is still slavery. This slave trade has lasted for more than 1,000 years. There is really no accurate way to determine exactly how many black people were enslaved by the Arabs, but many believe the number is greater than 100 million souls, depending on who is telling the narrative. And as we know, numbers are always debated in favor of the person telling the story. And when it comes to the accurate number of the people actually who suffered from these atrocities during the trans-Saharan slave trade, they always diminish the numbers. In other words, they never tell the truth. They lie. These kidnapped and enslaved people were used to do a variety of different jobs. Some were kept as domestic servants to maintain the home, cook, clean, and raise children. Some were soldiers, laborers, and others were concubines. Others were exploited for agricultural labor, all contributing to the overall wealth of the Arab countries that participated in the sub-Saharan slave trade. And as stated earlier, we often hear so much about the transatlantic slave trade, but we hear very little of the sub-Saharan slave trade. Many scholars believe that this slave trade was much worse than the transatlantic slave trade, and it certainly has gone on for a much longer period of time. And we ask on this channel, why do they or should they get a pass on the crimes that they've committed against humanity? Well, we say they shouldn't. And we feel that it is high time to put a spotlight on the atrocities that was done to these Africans. These people should not go without retribution. Unfortunately, this subject is taboo. We don't hear enough about the crimes of humanity that has been done against the Africans by the Arabs. It is as if that part of history did not even happen. And we are in the age of exposure, and these atrocities must be exposed, studied, and the perpetrators must be held accountable. As the discussion of reparations and being repaired are had, all who benefited has to pay their debt to the descendants and the victims of these crimes, many of whom are still alive today and are still being victimized. Could someone please tell me why is this? Why do these people get a pass?
Long before the Prophet Muhammad began his conquest, slavery existed, and he ensured to incorporate the practice within the Quran, following upon that religious creation, combining many of the teachings of both Judaism and Christianity. As Islam spread across the Arabian Peninsula, North Africa, Europe, and into Asia, slavery was a part of the process. Under Islam, slavery existed as a legitimate business from the late 6th century until the last Muslim nation officially banned slavery in the late 20th century. Slavery exploded under the early Abbasid Caliphate from around 750 to 950 AD, but not all slavery was equal in the Islamic world. Slaves from many ethnic and religious groups worked in building irrigation systems, various types of mining, animal husbandry, but also they served as conscripts, as soldiers, guards, domestic workers, and sex slaves. Most slaves came from non-Muslim regions, as enslaving fellow Muslims violated Islamic law. The Umayyads raided the Byzantine Empire and flooded the slave market with Greek, Serb, and Eastern European slaves, especially Slavs and Russians and Ukrainians. Using Slavs for hard physical labor led to a few slave revolts, such as the Zanj Rebellion of 1869 to 1883 in southern Iraq, which was a massive uprising of Bantu slaves captured in East Africa, which was so violent and impacting, it led to an end of that practice under the Abbasids. Another example comes from the Arab historian al-Utbi, who chronicled that after the Battle of Peshawar in the year 1001, Muslim armies in the midst of the land of the Hindustan had captured some 100,000 youths. Muslim slavers also scoured the Indian Ocean, hitting Indonesia and other island regions, taking millions of slaves over the centuries and converting them to Islam. Many rulers also used slaves in the military and administration to such an extent that slaves could seize power, as did the Mamluks in Egypt. Over time, they became a powerful military caste, often defeating the Crusaders, and on more than one occasion, they seized power for themselves, for example, ruling Egypt in the Mamluk Sultanate from 1250 to 1517. The Ottomans also greatly expanded slavery with their incursions into Central Europe during the Middle Ages through the late 16th century. White European slaves were the most sought after, especially women. This was also part of the North African white slave trade, and see our video on that subject, where Berbers and Moors raided Europe, even reaching Ireland, Iceland, and the coastal regions of England and Norway to kidnap slaves. It is estimated that over 1 million Europeans were taken over the centuries. Likewise, Russia and Ukraine were favorite hunting grounds for Muslim slavers, and untold millions of people fell into that life of enforced servitude. But by the 14th century and beyond, the bulk of Muslim slaves came from sub-Saharan Africa due to massive European military victories over the Ottomans, in particular from the 16th century onward. And although the Quran does not condone racial prejudice, the Arab slave traders often did, and the blacks were treated far worse than slaves from Ethiopia, Somalia, and other regions, especially the Europeans, a practice openly condemned by many Islamic leaders to their credit, especially among the Ottomans. Many will argue wrongly that Muslim slavery was not chattel slavery, and I will preempt that argument by saying that in some cases it actually was. Although many slaves, especially under the Ottomans, had the opportunity for upward social mobility, so did black slaves in the United States who received emancipation from their owners. Freedom from slavery being granted was almost unique to the United States, as such a practice was nearly unheard of in the Spanish Portuguese colonies, even in the British Empire. Slaves in the U.S. were considered valuable property, but not so in the Muslim world in many cases. Children in the Islamic slave markets were in high demand, far exceeding the Christian method even in the U.S. Many black Muslim slaves lived in appalling conditions, suffering abuse, malnutrition, and disease, with very low life expectancies and an astronomical infant mortality rate. As late as the 19th century, Western travelers in North Africa and Egypt noted the high death rate among imported black slaves. Of great interest, European political leaders in the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, where they wanted to carve Africa up for their own purposes, cited the slave trades in Africa as the prime reason for their respective colonial presences in Africa. But, in fairness, it should also be stated that this proposal for colonial expansion was also due in large part for the need to have their respective populations accept the individual national interests of creating new colonies. Southeast Africa and the Indian Ocean continued to be an important region for the Oriental slave trade up until the 19th century, and David Livingstone and Henry Morton Stanley were the first Europeans to reach the interior of the Congo River Basin, and they discovered that massive slave trade. In fact, the Arab trader Tibu Tip was the greatest of these slave traders, and please see our video on him. Therefore, Islamic slavery was brutal, expansive, long-lived, and very slow to end in the Muslim world, having lasted over 1,400 years as a legal and religious practice where religion and law, Sharia law, were one and the same. For example, here is a list of the Islamic nations and when they ended legal slavery. This will be of interest. Zanzibar ended slavery in 1909. Morocco ended slavery in 1922. Turkey, the post-Ottoman Empire, in 1924. Iran and Jordan ended slavery in 1929. Bahrain ended slavery in 1937, Kuwait in 1949, Qatar in 1952, Yemen and Saudi Arabia in 1962, while Oman followed with abolishing slavery as late as 1970. Mauritania became the last nation to abolish slavery in 1981, and in 1990, the Cairo Declaration on Human Rights in Islam declared that no one has the right to enslave another human being. Slavery in the Muslim world did not end due to a comparable Age of Reason or Enlightenment period pushing moral, religious, and social pressures, as had happened in Europe. Open legal slavery only ended because the Western industrialized nations would not do business with them in many cases, and these nations found that being a pariah state was not conducive to good international relations, let alone business. Also, all of these nations listed were at some point in time former colonial possessions or mandates of the major European powers, especially the former possessions of the Ottoman Empire until after World War I, and their influence was critical to achieving freedom for tens of millions as condition for the possession being granted independence. But believe it or not, even today there is still a thriving slave trade in Libya and Sudan, where government control does not exist and there is no international action or condemnation. Today, ISIS and other Islamic groups still take slaves, usually operating in lawless regions where no central governments exist, or if it does, it operates in name only. And they are not Christians. Just saying.